So I'm David Hayes, apparently the personification of President Obama, and I'm still waiting for my $10. I don't know much about blockchain, but I'll accept the $10. And this is actually how Ponzi schemes work, isn't it? Then I'm supposed to pass it along, but then I don't. But I say I do, or whatever. Anyway, I don't think we'll have a productive discussion about blockchain today. I do appreciate the chance to be here. I really enjoyed the event in Santa Fe that kicked off this initiative. And it's my pleasure to moderate. Oh yeah, one of these, this will be very helpful. It's 100 of something. Probably buy me a cup of coffee and. Okay, right. Next time I'm in Hanoi, I'll be really glad I have it. So it's my pleasure to just moderate this panel, first panel on the environmental determinants rather, in rural health. And I think this is really an appropriate place to start because for many of us, it's easy to understate the connection between the environment and rural health. And I think, in fact, this fact is reflective of a larger disconnect in the public's mind between environmental issues and health. For those of us who have been in the environmental and natural resources field for a long time, there's a very misleading arc of progress on the environment that obscures the very real, very serious, unfinished business when it comes to the environment. Our rivers and waterways are way cleaner now than they used to be. If you're in Los Angeles, you can see across the street now. The notorious Superfund sites have largely been cleaned up, or at least capped. They're out of sight, out of mind. And yes, there's great concern about climate change broadly, but people don't think about that in connection with human health. It's more of a physical concern. Sea rise, storm surge, drought, yes, fire, yes, but that's viewed as kind of a water supply issue, a property protection issue, not a health issue. And urban residents, I would say, in particular, are likely to be befuddled by why this panel is talking today, since they think of rural areas as the best place to be for health. Breathe in clear, unspoiled air. Take water from clean mountain streams. And get the benefit from going to work on a horse or something like that. But for all of us who have spent time in the rural West, we know the picture is much, much different. Some of the worst air quality in our nation, including a mix of particulates and carcinogens and smog, are found in the vast open spaces of our ag lands in the Central Valley, or in the oil and gas patch in northeastern Utah. And during the severe California drought, which it seems like we're about to go back into, hopefully not, but we learned that many rural communities in California can't get access to clean drinking water. Folks on the Great Plains have known that for a long time, not to mention Native American communities throughout much of the Southwest. And while few Americans realize the connection between climate change impacts and human health, it's the rural West that may teach us actually about that connection. As climate change profoundly impacts the rural West's natural resource base, as well as the challenges of extreme heat in a poor and often outdoor economy. So we've got three great discussants for our panel, each of whom have dedicated their careers to research in areas that are directly relevant to the environment-health connection in the rural West. So I'm going to introduce each of them, and then each of them will talk for 10 or 15 minutes about their perspectives and some of the relevant research that they've been doing. And then we're going to have an open discussion. Looking forward to that. So we're going to start with Dr. Mary Prunicki, followed by Dr. Craig Criddle, and then Dr. Chris Field. The only doctor I'm ever going to go to for real advice is Mary, but the others are doctors, as are most of you in this room. So first, Dr. Prunicki. Mary is an instructor in the Division of Pulmonology and Critical Care Medicine here at Stanford. She joined Carrie Nadeau's laboratory at the Sean Parker Center for Allergy Research at Stanford in July 2014. Her research investigates the effects of ambient air pollution on the immune system, especially with regard to asthmatic children. Interestingly, she started her career as a neurophysiologist after completing her PhD in psychobiology from Northwestern, where she was monitoring brain and spinal cord surgeries, conducting brainwave research, then at the Chicago Institute for Neuroscience and Neuroresearch. She got interested in part because of some family issues in terms of increasing rates of allergy and asthma and the underlying biological mechanisms that are being altered in those diseases. She recently co-authored a chapter with Dr. Nadeau titled "The Air We Breathe, How Extreme Weather Conditions Harm Us." And the focus of her remarks, I think today, will be on how to address ways to enhance asthma management in the rural population. She's doing really interesting work in Fresno of the aforesaid Central Valley. Then Craig Criddle will speak, and he's a professor of civil and environmental engineering at Stanford, a senior fellow in the Woods Institute for the Environment, and his lab and his research are legendary, though I'm embarrassed to say I only met Craig here this morning. I've heard about him for years. His focus is on biotechnology for clean water, renewable energy, and green chemistry. He teaches courses on aquatic chemistry, biotechnology, and public health engineering. Is a Utah State degree in 1982 and BS in civil and environmental engineering. Has an MS degree in environmental engineering and received his PhD here at Stanford in 1990. Was on the faculty at Michigan State for 9 years, returned here in 1998, has been a faculty member since then. Runs a very interesting lab that does a lot of practical technological development for water and wastewater purification and planning for integrated water and wastewater systems, and will have and is very much focused on large interdisciplinary field projects, and has some ideas here on that I think he'll talk to us about real-time monitoring of metrics for community health to assist in the prioritization of healthcare in different communities. Very relevant. And then Chris Field, who's the Perry McCarty Director of the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment here at Stanford. He's also the Melvin and Joan Lane Professor for Interdisciplinary Environmental Studies. His research focuses on climate change, ranging from work on improving climate models to prospects for renewable energy systems to community organizations that can minimize the risk of the tragedy of the commons. Very significantly, Chris was the founding director of the Carnegie Institution's Department of Global Ecology, a position he held here at Stanford from 2002 to 2016. And he was the co-chair of the Working Group 2 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change from 2008 to 2015, an enormously important period for the IPCC. He led the effort on the IPCC Special Report on managing the risks of extreme events and disasters to advance climate change adaptation, and the Working Group 2 contribution to the IPCC's 5th assessment report in 2014 on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. His widely cited work has earned a lot of recognition. U.S. National Academy of Sciences, Max Planck Research Award, Roger Revelle Medal. And he's going to focus on the health-climate interface again, I think, underappreciated connection and important part of his work. One of the many things I really enjoy about Chris is that, unlike many in the climate change world, he finds a way to be optimistic and solution-oriented. Keep that in mind. I think you'll see that at work here today. So let me turn it over to Mary first. And let's just be relaxed about this. We can take certainly clarifying questions after each discussion, and I think that makes some sense. And then open it up broadly after we've heard from all three folks. Mary?
So I just want to say I'm honored to be here today. I have a passion for this area. One, I have a passion for allergy disease research, which is what I've been doing for the past 3 years for personal reasons. Secondly, our research involves the Central Valley in California, which is a rural area, and we're studying the health effects and learning that it's just devastating, basically, the issues I'm going to talk about. And then three, I'm from rural Midwest. And so I see both worlds. A lot of my family is in the rural area, and a lot of the issues you're talking about is going on in rural Illinois and all over. So I'm very happy to be part of this initiative on many levels. The next couple minutes, I'm going to talk to you about allergic disease and how it is relevant to rural health. There is a rise in allergic disease for many reasons related in part to climate change. We're going to see an increase and are seeing an increase in complex allergies, which is going to put a higher demand on the healthcare system. The problems and increase in air pollution, water pollution, and ambient temperature increase is going to increase allergic disease problems. And the environmental changes that take place with climate change will affect pollen counts, the amount of stinging insects, and the presence or absence of molds. And all of these factors are increasing the problems with allergic disease. So I guess I can't see the slide notes. There was a study, a meeting, and in my notes I have what IPCC stands for. I think it's Intergovernmental Policy on Climate Change. And in 2013, they listed some phenomenon, and then they went on to say how likely they feel that these phenomena are going to happen in the future. So they're virtually certain that there's going to be higher temperatures, more hot days, and fewer minimum temperatures and fewer cold days. Very likely we're going to have heat waves. Likely we're going to have precipitation extremes, and they have medium confidence that there's going to be droughts or dryness. In the area of allergic disease, and specifically today I'll be talking about asthma, all of these conditions are going to make asthma disease worse. So the heat, the rain and thunderstorms, and then the drought or dryness causing the wildfires and the dust storms, all of these things are going to exacerbate allergic disease and asthma. And one question, obviously, that's relevant today is asthma really more prevalent in rural areas? There's been a few studies in the United States, but for the most part, when people talk about there being a decrease in asthma in rural areas, they're talking about studies done internationally, usually in Europe, and they're comparing people on actual farms with farm animals and comparing them to the city. And in those situations, they do see that the exposure to farm animals has a immune protective effect. So you actually see less allergy, less asthma, and things like that. But there's fewer studies actually looking at United States and comparing rural versus urban. Ebel in 2017 looked at the state of Georgia. And what he found is asthma rates are actually worse in rural areas due to socioeconomic factors such as income, lack of access to care, and things like that. And this coincides with the research that I'm going to present in the Fresno Valley. And then there's also been a recent study showing that even looking at asthma management and training with school nurses in the rural areas, there are not as many trained nurses in the schools, and there's not as many asthma management programs. So the children in rural areas are at a disadvantage because asthma management is key to controlling the disease. So the approach Kari Nadeau and our lab has taken is to look at how these environmental impacts affect disease, specifically the immune system. More than 33% of diseases in small children are caused by environmental exposures. The risk factors that are going to be talked about today as far as environmentally are air pollution, which we focus on, water pollution, pesticides, and contaminants from the diet. And we try to link back these environmental exposures back to the immune system and how it alters your immune system and either causes or exacerbates disease. So in our lab, we look at the environmental exposures of air pollution, tobacco smoke, some pesticides, and then diet. And we look at usually blood samples, and we look at various types of analyses, and we try to relate that back to the different disease types, primarily asthma. Also, the lab does a lot of food allergy studies. But some of the things we're finding obviously relates back to a lot of other chronic diseases. Okay, so for about the past 10 years, the lab has gotten blood from the Central Valley. The reason the Central Valley is of interest is because every year they're at least in the top 4 for all the ambient air pollutants. There's a map on the right. I believe that's for ozone. It doesn't really matter. They're always in the red. They always get an F, no matter what pollutant you look at. It has improved over the course of years while they've tried to tighten up public policy. But these people, some for just because of the topography, but also because of what's going on around them, have real issues. The national child asthma rate is 13.8. Here we're saying that in the Fresno, we actually studied the Fresno area in the Central Valley. Asthma rates are up to 21%, but some of our research, we're seeing kids have asthma rates up to 33%, which is much, obviously, higher than the national allergy average. And then allergies in general are increased in Fresno. So typically what we do is we started out by recruiting from the school systems in Fresno. The kids there, the air quality is so bad, they have flags, and if the air quality is poor, I think they get a red flag, they can't go outside and play. If it's good, you get a green flag. So they spend less time outdoors because of the air quality. And what we do is we draw blood from these subjects, have the blood shipped overnight to the lab, and then run various studies on the blood, and we look over time. We're also looking at pregnant women, looking at their blood, looking at that baby's cord blood, and then that baby in the first and second year of life to see how the impact of air pollution is altering the immune system. Much of the work has been done in association with Berkeley and a project called CHAPS. And so these, some of the pollutants that we measured are listed there. On the right, it shows for the Fresno area where some of their pollution is coming from. And down in the lower left this is the Fresno area, and every little open circle is home residence of a subject that we've collected blood from. And then the pink shapes are where they have central monitoring sites to measure air pollution. And so in our research, this is just an example of one study, we have a model, and for each residential home, each circle, we have an algorithm to determine from those pollution monitoring stations, if they were in that house 24 hours a day, how much pollution would they actually be exposed to? And so we look at how much pollution they're exposed to up to a year before the blood draw to try to figure out which pollutants are most harmful to the immune system, and also what type of time exposures are necessary to see immune changes. I won't really go into this, but this, if you're familiar with the immune system, we're primarily interested in T cells. There's a subset called the T helper cells, and in asthma, classically, it's been thought of as an imbalance between the Th1 and Th2 cells, for those of you interested. And so our question is, does exposure to air pollution alter these T cells and make asthma worse? So when we receive the blood overnight, there's a lot of processing that goes on, and we've been looking at the blood markers. We are using kind of not a novel technique, but it's relatively novel, and we're using something called the Cytoff machine, and we're taking the blood and staining it with metal surface markers. And then we run it through a machine, and the cell by cell, one cell at a time, the cells are vaporized, and the metal tags let us know what type of cell type it was for that person's blood, and what surface markers and even intercellular markers were present on that one cell. So we look at it cell by cell. We look at about 1 million cells for one blood sample, and we're able to, at a level never before possible, look at the immune components within the blood and how they're changing. And what we're finding is that healthy subjects have a very different immune signature than asthmatic subjects. And this is irrespective of pollution. We know that asthmatics have a different methylation pattern, which I'll just briefly touch on later. So asthmatics look different from the start, and we know that air pollution has a more detrimental effect on these people. And we also do other types of techniques, and this is just to show you we're able to try to tease out short-term exposure to air pollution versus long-term exposure. And what we see is that the immune signature changes. So it's not just a physical problem that you're breathing this air. Your immune system is actually being altered. And then there's been a lot of work looking at methylation, DNA methylation. And what happens is when you're exposed to pollution, methyl groups get basically tagged onto your DNA. And what that does is it controls the amount of activity of the gene. So when you're exposed to high air pollution, what we found is that you get an increase in this methylation for some genes that control immune function. And so your immune system effectively does not work as well. And I can explain it in more detail if you would like. So you're actually getting modifications of the activity level of your immune system just by exposure to air pollution. And on the right, you can see we looked at 2 genes. One is called the FOXP3 gene, and one is called the IL-10 gene. And what you can see is that if you look at pollution levels 90 days before the blood draw, that seems to be perhaps a key time point at which we can associate the level of air pollution exposure with the level of methylation of the DNA. And we're looking to see if this methylation change is sustained. We suspect so. It's not confirmed. And we know that the asthmatics are more adversely affected than the healthy controls. We also know in the Fresno region where everybody's exposed to high air pollution, none of the subjects look immunologically normal. Even the healthy kids have elevated IgE, which is what you see in allergic disease. So we've tried to give back to the Fresno area. Kari has done a lot of public education. She's been on the public radio down there. She's been in the newspapers trying to spread the word about the ill health effects of this air, of the air pollution. She's sort of an advisor of the city planning boards. She's been asked to explain the effects of air pollution on DNA to Congress. There's been a variety of youth education programs we've been involved in the Fresno area, trying to educate the population on the dangers of air pollution and the effects it's having on their health. But obviously that's not enough, and we would like to participate in taking this step forward. And a few things that I see as problems is that in the Fresno area, not everybody, it should be internet and Wi-Fi, not everybody actually has access to broadband. In addition, the Fresno area is below poverty level in a lot of areas. They can't afford the internet. And we know that for at least asthma, in order to control it well and avoid asthma triggers, it requires education. And there's quite a barrier there in access to care. And we feel that not only asthma education, but other chronic disease education would enhance in rural area the ability to kind of combat some of these diseases. And lastly, we know that there's still much public policy work to be done. For example, in the Fresno area, there's a lot of dairy farms, and the cows produce methane, and that is not regulated. In addition, recently there's been some talk of reevaluating a 2015 rule that says you have to be at least 18 to handle pesticides. You know, it's things like that where there's not a knowledge of how exposures to different type of environmental pollutants can affect your health directly and indirectly, that is kind of scary and needs more work. So thank you. If you have any questions about allergic disease or why we're interested in the Fresno region, we'd be glad to answer it.
Let's have clarifying questions maybe while Mary's here, and then we'll move to Craig and Chris. Can I ask a clarifying question?
Sure.
You mentioned the methane from dairy cows. You know, Chris's ears perked up, as did mine, because that's, you know, it's a very powerful greenhouse gas.
Right.
But I'm interested in the connection between methane and public health. I mean, what is
to my knowledge, there's not regulation of that, and the Fresno is surrounded by a lot of dairy farms. So there's no, if I remember correctly,
right.
The cows are fed a cheap diet,
Yeah.
which causes an increase in the amount of methane produced
Right.
by them.
No, right. You're right about all that. But I mean, what is the methane is that a chemical that has
It's
asthmatic implications, for example, or is it just one more pollutant that's part of that soupy mix that's the problem?
correct. It's one more pollutant. In our lab, we have not specifically studied methane. I think that
see.
would be hard to do.
Right.
But it's
Yeah.
one of the reasons that it is thought that the Fresno area is so heavily polluted.
Got
One
it.
of many.
Got it.
Yeah.
Other clarifying questions for Mary before we turn to Craig? Felicity.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Felicity Barringer. I'm a journalist at the Lane Center. I'm curious about your slide that said what the sources of pollution were. 57% were motor vehicles, I understand that. But a much larger percentage than I would have thought, 20%, was like lawn cleaning material, basically things like those leaf blowers that so many communities have. And I was curious of the source of that, and do you know if any efforts been made to control the pollution from off-road vehicles, lawn and garden equipment, and consumer products?
So
that was a much higher percentage than I expected.
Yeah, I believe this slide is the diagram is a few years old. There has been a big push in the Fresno area, for example, to, there was a school, I don't know if they put school buses in that category. There's been a big push environmentally to fix some of those things. So I know there's been some changes. So I assume it's gone down somewhat. I would have to look up to see what is considered lawn and I am assuming it's tractors, but I don't know for sure.
Two questions. One is, of the interventions that you mentioned,
Uh-huh.
has there been any cost-benefit analysis as to what might have the highest level of impact?
As far as how to educate the rural population?
Or just to decrease asthma rates in the Central Valley?
So there hasn't been a formal analysis. We're actually trying to apply for grants to have a way to educate and obviously then reduce the amount of asthma attacks and the amount of uninsured that, for example, show up in the ER and need to be hospitalized because they didn't have appropriate asthma management care.
Okay. And my second question, I spend quite a bit of time in Yosemite as a climber, and one thing we notice is when there are fires in the south, the entire valley fills up with smoke, and it's an incredible, weather system that brings that there. Given the sort of inevitability of pollution moving from LA upwards, is it just getting people indoors? What are the interventions that are the most useful for people? So
this afternoon, Kari Nadeau is going to mention a study using indoor air purifiers. Obviously, there's been a push to control some of the outdoor motor vehicle and tractor and those types of sources. It's always going to be a problem in the Fresno area because it sits in a valley. And my understanding is that actually our pollution blows down there. And because it's in a valley, especially in the summer, you get a layer of ozone, and then everything is just intensified. So it's probably never going to go away. And so short of reducing more and more the environmental exposures down there, it's a hard problem to fix.
All right, final question, then we'll move to Craig, and we'll get a chance for more discussion afterwards.
Thank you for a great talk. Does your lab or any other space do research on, so these are pollutants causing allergies and asthma. What about?
We're finding associations,
right,
yeah.
Association, right. What about reforestation or investments in actually building up the environment back to forests versus farms, and how that affects the incidence of allergies amongst the population?
So I don't know the answer specifically to that. I do know that it's pretty clear if you're on what you would consider a farm in healthy, clean air, your allergy rates will go down, and there's various theories as to why that happens. I think it's a great area of interest, but I'm not aware of research that's looked at that.
And hold that thought till after Chris Field talks, because
He knows the answer.
yeah, he knows a lot about that. Thank you, Mary.
You're welcome.
Let's get Craig up here. Just this is such a great chance to do interdisciplinary thinking on this subject. So I've spent a lot of my career learning about parts per million of ozone, and I'm working with some state attorneys general who are fighting to maintain the lower ozone standard that the Obama administration put in place, but rarely have folks like me been exposed to, the data that demonstrate the incredibly direct line, what seems to be an incredibly direct line between ozone levels and real life human health issues. So terrific. So Craig, whenever you're ready.
Okay, so thank you, Bruce, for the invitation to be here today, and David for introduction. I appreciate that. It's nice to follow Mary's nice talk. Mine will be more focused on what we're planning to do, not what we've actually done, but hopefully give you some ideas for discussion later. The topic here I'm going to address is information that we could potentially extract from wastewater. Some background. For the last 10 years or so, we've been working to build a new testing facility at Stanford that allows us to do pilot scale testing of technology for resource recovery from wastewater and waste streams, to create value from these things, recovering valuable products from the waste. And this has entailed construction of a facility here on campus, the Codiga Center. And in this center, we're able to divert wastewater off the Sarah Street sewer here and in through the facility, where we have a series of treatments that we can apply to the wastewater to purify it. These technologies are really innovative new things that could change the way we think about wastewater treatment here in the United States and around the world, actually. And we're also interested in diverse, or basically intelligent infrastructure and development of sensors and monitoring capability to go with this treatment capability that we have already. This is illustrating off to the right there is a technology we're testing that allows us to remove organic matter from wastewater very effectively, very efficiently. It's the first test in North America of this technology. And that's Professor Perry McCarty there, emeritus professor from here at Stanford, who went over to Korea for many years to help work on this technology and develop it. And we brought it now to Stanford for the first tests here. And it's now operating and it looks good. So when we talk about recovery of resources from wastewater, I typically think about, and you probably would think about water. We want to recover clean water from wastewater. We'd like to recover renewable energy. We'd like to recover materials of value. For example, our lab does some things to recover bioplastic from waste organic matter. And that can be of high value, relatively high value, to help offset the costs of treating the water. But another thing we can recover from wastewater, besides these material things, is information. And it could be very valuable information, actually, as I hope to persuade you here with what I'm going to talk about next. So upstream of the Codiga Resource Recovery Center, we have this sewer network. It's a little one. It serves 7,000 people and includes on it the president of the university, who's a contributor. And we also have the Vaden Student Health Center is on it, which it turns out to be extremely useful and interesting for what we might do with it. And we're proposing to monitor the network. We have a BioX proposal that was funded to do that. That funding was leveraged by the Lane Center with the development of a novel monitoring system, which I'll show you in a few minutes. And the idea is to track genes in the wastewater for community health. There's more than just genes, as I hope I can persuade you, but that's where we want to start. So if we look at the things we could track, there's all sorts of information that maybe you've used, especially when we're thinking about integrated systems. One is flow of water and solids, nutrients and salt. That's one bit of information we could recover that could be valuable. Another is chemicals of public health interest. This would include things like drugs, metals, If you have lead in your drinking water, there will be lead in your wastewater. And so it's basically a record of everything that's a community is doing, is the wastewater. And so we also have their genes of public health interest, for example, pathogens, and in particular, I think, and perhaps very importantly for this group, antibiotic resistance genes. So if we look at chemicals of public health interest, they are being monitored in over 60 cities in Europe right now on a regular basis. And it's interesting. I'm showing here one of the, if you go to this interactive tool that's online, I've given the link there, you can look at all these different cities. You can see the use of cocaine, for example. That's what's showing here. I'm showing cocaine usage in all these cities around Europe, over 60 cities. It's kind of an impressive effort. And I don't know all the details about how the information will be used, but I think there's many possible uses of this kind of information. Major effort. We can also think about pathogens of public health concern, and there could be specific ones that are important for a local community that need to be monitored. There could be previously undetected pathogens. Potentially, there could even be people who are unknown to them are carriers of pathogens in a community, and that might be picked up through wastewater. Virulence genes. There could be antibiotic resistance genes developing in response to overuse of antibiotics in animals, for example, or in human populations. So we think about pathogens of local concern, and you think about San Francisco, the influenza comes to mind right away. We had horrible incidents of influenza back in 1918 to 1919. Even right now, we're experiencing a fairly significant influenza outbreak. So it turns out the influenza viruses can be monitored in wastewater, and that's one of the targets that we're interested in. So this mobile unit, we started with a little bit of funding from the NSF, National Science Foundation, Food, Energy, Water Initiative, and a little bit of money got us going on this, but what really made it possible was the Lane Center funding, and so I want to acknowledge that and thank you, Bruce, for that. That allowed us to design and now fabricate, and soon, probably this week or next, the delivery will occur. The mobile units will be brought in. These are trailers outfitted so that we can do monitoring of pathogens. So they're biosafety level 2 lab, essentially on wheels, that allows us to do things, we think, in a new way. And to have mobility provides several advantages, which I'll get into later. But there's all the air handling facilities that are needed to safely track and monitor pathogens. And then there's all the capabilities that we need to do molecular analyses of the pathogens. So if we look at the things that it enables us to do, mobility enables flexibility in the choice of locations and sampling. We can sample somewhere, we get an unusual result. If we can get the readout quickly, then we can do more intensive sampling to clarify and make sure it's a real signal and get more information or sample more extensively as needed in other locations. It gives rapid, low-cost assays, potentially is what we're focusing on. Early detection, so if we have influenza, people would be shedding virus before it's manifest in the community, so we could hopefully pick it up sooner. Provide visibility, direct interaction with communities. That's a nice thing. So we go into the community and say, okay, here's what we're doing. We bring it in. We engage the community. Local public health officials are interested. We would expect that. We've talked to San Francisco, for example. Department of Health in San Francisco is interested in this idea and could be good for emergency response, especially. So our initial targets, what we're beginning with are norovirus and influenza, and then we have bacteria, pathogenic E. coli and salmonella. And eukaryotes would be Ascaris and Cryptosporidia. Those are our targets right now. You'll recognize some of those are very important in rural communities and all around the world in various contexts. If we look at rural health in particular, antibiotic resistance, I think, could be very important. We've done some initial assay of antibiotic resistance at the Codiga Center using just our normal sampling tools. And it's interesting. We're getting significant antibiotic resistance, appearance of antibiotic resistance signals at Stanford on the campus. And it'll be interesting to see how this compares with other locations as we move this mobile unit. Right? Yeah, could be antibiotic, yeah, from the students. So, yeah, we have about half students in our 7,000 people service area. We have about half are students and half are old people, I think, you know, right? So it's sort of bimodal. Could mobile unit wastewater monitoring help guide antibiotic prescriptions and use in smaller hospitals with limited resources? I'm just throwing out some questions that I think are interesting in this context. How does livestock influence development of antibiotic resistance? I think that's an important issue, right? I assume, Mary, right? You would know better than me. Zoonotic diseases, these are diseases that trace back to the zoo. No, they trace back to animals, right? So there's animal hosts, ascariasis, brucellosis, ascariasis in pigs, and brucellosis in cattle. So I would think these might be things that, could a mobile unit monitoring enable early detection and intervention in such cases? What can be reliably detected? That's an important scientific question that we need to address, and we understand that, so we have high-powered statistician working on this problem as well. So can we develop integrated holistic resort measures of community health? Could we add air monitoring to this mobile unit? I think probably it could be at some point potentially added. So potential impacts, we think of these as public community, basically community health sentinels might be envisioned in the future. Early detection of antibiotic resistance, early detection of pathogens of concern, local concern. Maybe discovery of undetected pathogens that may be present in a community. And we have an onboard sequencer, so we do DNA sequencing onboard in the reactor, in the mobile lab, yes. So long-term, we would have metrics of community health that we could envision, extensions to diet. Food has a DNA signal. Information on drugs, of course, as I mentioned before, metal contaminants and so on. So there's a lot of areas of, I think, that where this could have an impact that would be positive for rural communities. And I just acknowledge the support of all these different groups. We've had a lot of internal support at Stanford for this. And also I have to mention, I got some weird text thing there, but we also had the the NSF Center for NSF Research Center, Engineering Research Center, Reinventing the Nation's Urban Water Infrastructure. That's been an important help with this development of this research, and I already mentioned the Bill Lane Center for its help in really launching this mobile unit initiative. And that's all I have. Thank you. Yes. Yeah.
What an excellent motivational conversation with a couple issues. Have you thought about how you quantify and qualify the incentives and penalization of what you find in the community so you get them to act on it more aggressively? And then how do you communicate your message? You have such a profound message. It's changed orientation. It makes sense. Like, brings me back to when I looked at the same issue in Bernardsville, New Jersey, for my master's in engineering on the same issue. So is there a way of financially putting dollars on what's the return on investment when you started to point out what you get and what you do? So then the story has a little bit more power to it. Mm-hmm. So I think
that's a good idea. And we definitely
I think you got
need
a mission and a goal, and you also have something that's tangible. I mean, I'd love to see these mobile vans as I drive around the rural West and pick and choose, because it's actually apropos of Paul Weiss's question. He's not in the room at the moment. When he said, how do you find out where to do the project to innovate the community? It's very practical, very basic. It's both research oriented and it's directed oriented, because something can change. Just by even going into the community, you can get them motivated, because it's all things for all people. So I'm
as I mentioned, it's resource recovery, and we've been thinking of all these other ways to recover resources that have value, monetary value. I think the information value is very high, actually. It hasn't been monetized in the way you're describing, and I think that's been our vision all along. How can we think about making a sustainable model that works not just in terms of intervention, but also financially sustainable model that could allow communities to get the information needed to make better decisions about how they use their limited resources for public health protection.
Right, and one last thing is, how do you put in the word scalability into your discussion?
Well, scalability in this case, I think, means that the scalability would be in replicating the design. We put in a lot of time now in the development of this design for these mobile labs. And now we have a template. We'll be testing it in the coming year at Stanford and hopefully more, but we'll be doing all the testing. We need to know what is the meaning of these signals that we get from the wastewater? What does it mean? What's statistically significant? So we need to be able to understand that data, and then also how to maybe characterize the network. So we have some ideas how we'll do some things to characterize the sewer network so that we understand it, and when we make a recommendation or draw a conclusion, that it's grounded in evidence. Yeah, that's what we need to do.
One last quick point. How do you look for public-private partnership? Because what you're doing, there's a vast body of waste out there.
Yeah.
And then how do you...
Well, public and private, definitely, this is definitely a case where this is true. So if we take antibiotic resistance as an example,
That's right.
You know, suppose we find that a community is developing antibiotic resistance to some class of antibiotics. Well, they need to change. And now, that information, who is that useful to? It's useful to the community. It's useful also to pharmaceutical companies. So there's several groups that could benefit from that kind of information. Yeah, yeah, yes.
I'm just trying to visualize, how does it actually happen? Do you just get an average from, 7,000 people? Are you able to like go over to street A and take a dip in the water and put it in your, like how much can you specify where the waste is coming from?
Well, I mean, we're getting an aggregate measure of community health. That's what I would think of it that way right now.
Okay.
And now we really do need to understand what that means, right? So we have some initial target pathogens that we begin with. We might also do some metagenomes, right? And then look to see what we're seeing in the broader sense. What's the diversity of pathogens there? I have a former, or a friend and colleague at University of Hong Kong who did do some monitoring across the transect from an influent all the way through a community, through the wastewater treatment plant.
Oh, okay.
And what he saw was, at the time there were something like 550 bacterial pathogens in the genome, or full genomes for 550 bacterial pathogens. And he got hits on something like 80. So some evidence for possibly significant number of unknown pathogens in that community in Hong Kong. Now, how it would be in communities around the United States, I don't know, or in rural communities, I can't say yet, right?
Okay. Wow.
Yeah,
Interesting.
thank you.
Final clarifying question,
Yes.
Felicity?
Fascinating discussion. Thank you very much. I'm curious about other places that something like this is being used. Is what you're developing a first-in-the-world model, or you said there were some wastewater evaluation models in lots of countries elsewhere in the world? What kinds of things are they finding, and how much more precise does the model need to be?
Well, so I mentioned the chemical monitoring in Europe. There's 60 major cities, where they're monitoring with LCMS technology. They're monitoring the chemicals, the drugs, illegal and legal drugs that are in the wastewater. So you can get a huge amount of information from that. How that information is being used, I'm not sure right now. I need to learn more about that. But that's a very important issue, how it's being used, how the information is being used, and how it's being interpreted. And we need to, and I don't know of anyone who's doing routine monitoring of wastewater. There are a few groups that have done some monitoring of wastewater in different ways, and I alluded to one in Hong Kong right earlier. But the systematic monitoring with mobile units, I don't think that's been done with pathogens.
And how recent has this been done in 60 cities in Europe? How recent?
Oh, this is going back they started this initiative some years ago. You can check the website. I can give you the link if you'd like. Yeah, absolutely. It's a very impressive website. I mean, you can see from the bubbles, right, how much usage of cocaine in every city of Europe, all these major cities of Europe. You can see that. It's right there in the wastewater. Yeah.
Wow.
Yes.
Question causes me to wonder whether you might be able to, covering your 7,000 Stanford people here, put a series of monitors in micro-locations, basically, along that sewer pipe.
Yeah.
And see what's going into it and get a more specific analysis to help with this question.
The reason, the BioX proposal we submitted and have funded through Stanford, through the BioX program, involves looking at using tracers So we go upstream on the sewer, and we put in tracers that we can track through the system and then detect at the Codiga Center with the automated sampling systems that we have in place there. And so this is definitely something we need to characterize networks, and we need to have a protocol for how to do that.
Yeah.
And when we send these out on the road, these units might not go alone. They might go with a trailer, maybe with flowers on it and hippies in it, something like that, that has in it, hippie students, that has in it all the sampling units, right?
Yeah.
Automated samplers. They're in that van. And so you take that out on the road. That's how I envision it. It's on the road. This unit, these mobile units, they're very expensive. We don't want to put them in unsecure locations. So we put it in a secure location at a centralized treatment plant of the different communities. Almost every community has a centralized treatment plant of some kind, a secure place. And then the mobile labs disperse, take out these automated samplers and disperse them around the network in the way you were talking about. How to do that? We still have a long ways to go, right, to understand how to do that.
Oh, okay, can we hold,
Yeah.
let's get Chris Field's presentation and then have some more. So thank you very much, Craig. That was fascinating. So I think we're going to have Volkswagen buses with flowers on them in the Fresno area. Time to be determined.
Well, thanks, David, and thanks, everybody. What I'd like to do in just a few minutes is unfold some thoughts about the diversity of the relationships between rural health and climate change. And of course, there are a huge number of dimensions of health that we can be talking about. We've already talked about some mix of acute and chronic diseases. There are lots of potential issues of interest with malnutrition and nutritional health, lots of issues with mental health, and even issues with quality of life that involve fitness and opportunities for exercise. Each of those has a big thread that could be unfolded through a series of explorations related to the climate change impacts. And I'm only going to sample briefly a few of those and put more of the emphasis on a conceptual framework for thinking about the relationship between climate change and rural health. And the first theme that I want to talk about a little bit is the nature of risk from a changing climate. And in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that you've already heard a lot about, we think about the risk from a changing climate as really emerging from the overlap between three very different kinds of processes. One are the hazards from the changing climate. That's things like a temperature shock or a drought or a heavy thunderstorm. The vulnerability or the lack of preparedness, and that includes things like the health status of the individuals that are in harm's way. It has things like the quality of the public health delivery system. It has things like the ability to go into areas where protective measures, air conditioning and filtering and water purification and stuff like that are available. And then it has a big component that's due to exposure. What are the assets, the individuals, the ecosystems, the economies that are at risk? And you can think about the risk from a changing climate as really emerging from the overlap of these three things. And when we think about climate change risks, what are the issues with rural health that particularly impact the vulnerability part? And we know a lot about what's happening with the hazards. And with vulnerability, all of the issues with health really come to maturity and come into focus. The one I want to mention in particular is relatively clear evidence that risk of exposure to a number of kinds of pollutants, but especially ozone-causing pollutants, tend to go up as the temperature goes up, mainly because the atmospheric chemical processes that are producing these pollutants get to be more and more competent at producing them as the temperature rises. So as a consequence of that, all of the issues with the air quality exposure in the Central Valley get to be intensified as the temperatures go up. But vulnerability doesn't come just from the air quality issues, and there are tons of issues already with water security, both the quantity of water that's available and the quality. You know, during our historic drought from 2011 to 2016, there were several communities in the Central Valley that actually ran out of water, and the issues of water security in terms of economic and lifestyle security I think are going to be among the most important, certainly in California. Long-term ability to provide necessary quantity and quality of water for the full range of users is going to be a key challenge. And when we talk about the economic sustainability of the region, water availability is going to be really important. A second thing that I would say in the climate change community we don't have a very good handle on, but is going to be increasingly important in the future, is to understand that each of the environmental risks we face, whether they're public health risks or climate change risks, economic development risks, occurs in a multi-stressor context. And in many cases, we're really good at you know, putting on our laser-like focus and saying, okay, here's the way that asthma risks unfold in a current public health setting, or here's the way that risks of a temperature shock unfold. But we don't know very much about the way that the risks change when we're looking at simultaneous development of air quality issues, water availability issues, economic sustainability issues, public health education issues, reliability of the electrical supply. And one of the things that's really going to be a priority for the future is understanding the implications of working in a multi-stressor environment. A third theme that I just want to introduce as one to think about is that when we talk about adapting to changing climate or to changing set of public health risks, we often tend to think in terms of what are adaptation steps that make the most sense for a healthy, young, fit population. And there's been a tendency in public policy and health policy and in climate policy to ignore the fact that a really substantial fraction of the people who with responsibility to protect come with some kind of a disability. This comes into sharpest focus when you look at things like coastal flooding risk, where the standard response in adaptation say, well, let's just elevate the houses. But then you say, well, how many people actually have a mobility issue where having a long stairway leading up to your house means that it's not practical to live there anymore? And when you think about the health status of the American population and the full range of strategies that we're considering for adaptation, it turns out that some kind of an important disability impacts a majority of the people. And when we think about adaptation strategies, we need to be really cognizant of that. I'd say it's a frontier that we have really just begun to open the door on, and it's going to be increasingly important to recognize that our options for adaptation need to be considered a lot more deeply, with recognition of the fact that the range of people and the range of disabilities we need to deal with is really broad. A fourth theme I want to talk a little bit about begins to move toward the area of solutions. And as David said, I do always try to find pathways where at least there's some hope for optimism. And one of the really interesting issues that I think we're beginning to see in rural health now has to do with the challenges we face in terms of managing wildfires. And of course, the devastating wildfires that we've seen over just the last few weeks have emphasized why wildfires are so complicated for two totally different reasons. One, really hard to contain the physical damage from wildfires in California, but it also is really hard to contain the air quality impacts from wildfires. And one of the interesting, frustrating features of current California environmental policy is that air particle emissions from natural wildfires don't have to be accounted in our greenhouse gas budget, but emissions from controlled burns do. And so it's really clear that if we wanted to do a better job of reducing fire risk in the West, and especially in California, what we would do is institute an aggressive program of controlled burns to decrease the fuel loads, to allow trees to grow faster and create healthier forest environments. We're actually prescribed from doing that now for two important reasons. One is that our cap and trade doesn't allow the greenhouse gas emissions from prescribed burns, even though if the same forest burned up in a wildfire, those emissions wouldn't count. And then second, in most cases when prescribed burns are proposed, the air quality implications are unacceptable, even though it's pretty clear that the air emissions associated with a whole series of prescribed burns are much less dangerous and much less consequential in terms of total amount than would be the case if the same forest had burned up in a wildfire. So we have an important policy opportunity that we can address there, but we do need to recognize that as wildfires shape more and more of California's future, that we need to figure out what to do about the currently uneven interface between wildfire and managed fire. The fifth topic I want to just mention as an important conversation starter is that California has really been at the forefront of looking at climate change as an issue that has profoundly important environmental justice components. And when we look at a lot of the steps that have been proposed for improving our responses to climate change, not only here, but in rural areas around the world, in many cases, those are foreclosing on rural opportunities. We're talking about changing agricultural processes, eliminating, in many cases, important sources of agricultural income, whether they're coal mining or oil and gas exploration, water development. And one of the things we really need to think a lot harder about is how to prevent ambitious action on climate change from foreclosing on economic opportunities in rural areas, because in many cases the public health consequences are directly connected with the economic stature of locations. And is this mainly an agenda that needs to be pursued through education, or does it need to be something that has a relocation component? Or how do we think about integrating rural lifestyles into climate solutions? And that's really the final topic that I want to talk about. There are many, many pathways that are being pursued in terms of climate solutions. And it's clear that a large number of those can involve actions in natural and working lands, whether they're steps to improve carbon storage in soils and rangelands and croplands, or whether they're methods to increase the carbon that's stored in forests or to reduce the risk of fires in forests, or to maintain renewable energy facilities that are wind and solar in rural areas. And I think that the bottom line, the message I want to leave you with is that when we think about multi-stressor environments and when we think about the intersection of public health and climate change, a lot of the solutions are going to come from creating vibrant rural economies, and we can use approaches to climate change to help assure that the economic vitality of the rural communities is in place. At the same time, it's addressing some of the key drivers of the health challenges we face. And that's where I'll stop. Thanks so much.
Have one or two clarifying questions while Craig and Mary come back up so that we can have a discussion with all three of our presenters. But first, clarifying questions of Chris, Phil?
Yeah, I applaud you on your global sense. How do you take your whatever you call stressors, and get them to a social common position, both from the ground up to the top down, so you can see actionable items? I mean, the whole issue is, if I use an example, is the UN's SDGs. So there a lot of work went into the enactment. You got enacted. So how is that going from the conceptual policy state to the reality state with your thoughts? Because I will just give you one thing dealing with the climate change. As I travel around this country, people don't like the word climate change. It doesn't sell very well
Yeah, well, certainly.
That's not a challenge to you, Lauren.
No, I think it's really important to recognize that the more complicated you make a policy challenge, the more hurdles you have to overcome in order to mobilize the public to embrace the opportunities. And California has a really, really interesting policy environment, and obviously in many ways it's going in the opposite directions from the national policy environment. And what I think has been really interesting in California has been the resolution of the tension between the environmental activists and the environmental justice activists, because, well, there's still tension, obviously, but as the California legislature moved forward last year towards passage of new climate change legislation, there was a real question about whether the environmental justice community would buy in to the idea that addressing climate change was something we should all be working together on, or whether these risks to economic viability and environmental justice were too great to sustain. And to California's credit, the two sides really came together and said, you know, here's an overlap where we can work together. And the way I think about it with the full range of issues we're talking about now is that, you know, we used to have a framing of environmental issues. Well, I'll put it in the climate change context, but I would say it's true in general for the environment, where we said we have a fixed pool of resources. We can either spend them on mitigation, decreasing the damages. We can spend them on adaptation, improving our ability to cope with whatever nature throws at us, or we can invest the resources in economic development and hope that we can somehow grow our way out of this. And I think that framing has set up the kind of conflict that you characterize. But I think if you look at where we are now in terms of the technology and the social dynamics, what we see is that there's an increasingly large area of overlap between the mitigation, adaptation, and development objectives. And that's where we can focus in an area that everybody may not agree on all the elements, but they can agree on enough to start a conversation.
Why don't you join us here, Chris? Yes, Bruce.
Well, I just, when you get a chance,
You're running this thing. You get a chance whenever you want, Bruce.
Actually, just on your last point there, you know, I do think that it's possible that focusing more on the healthier aspects of the environment may be a way of refocusing the debate over climate change away from the sort of economic development versus, you know, new forms of energy, because, you know, clearly communities that are threatened by sea level rise directly or threatened by particular events, that's you're into getting people's attention, because the basic problem with public opinion and climate change is you're asking people to pay costs now for benefits that are going to be in the future and are uncertain, because while we know as an aggregate phenomenon it's happening, what will happen in any given area has more of an error bar around it. Even with our models about sea level rise, we can't say with certainty that it's going to be in a certain street as opposed to another street, because there's going to be a lot of other events that have to happen. So it may be refocusing on these things that have to do with healthiness per se is another way of diffusing the sort of conflict. So that's just a comment.
Yeah, one thing I'll add that's not particularly California relevant, but is certainly relevant to rural areas around the U.S. is that where that comes into sharpest focus is with coal and emissions from coal, and,
Right.
and there's no question that there's a huge, immediate, profound benefit from decreasing and eliminating the use of coal in the energy system, and that plays out both in terms of public health benefits and in terms of climate benefits.
Yeah, I mean, in one of the projects we started on and realized how hard the measurement is, and it gets to mobile units, is people that live around sites with a lot of fracking or where they're flaring. We suspect that the communities suspect that there are real health consequences of that. We looked at, well, what would it take to do a Criddle with air? And there are such companies that do that, but it's extremely expensive. But the kind of monitoring you get from the EPA doesn't allow you to get into that kind of source monitoring, and that's a real need, it seems to me, in these areas, which gets to my larger point, okay? there's a reason the three of you are on this panel. They're the invisible hand of conspiracy, Bruce Kane, because I've had conversations with all three of you, and it gets to the following question I have, because I know you're interested in the environmental impacts of air quality and fires. Craig's interested in moving his mobile unit around. He originally was thinking urban. I got him to think a little rural. And we already have a project going into Fresno, and you asked me just a few days ago, what communities should we be thinking about? So the question that I'm going to ask over and over again is, everybody could go to a different community in a different area, but are there benefits for Craig working a little bit more closely with Mary and with you? That is, if we were in one community called Fresno, where we were monitoring the air for both what you're interested in and what you're interested in, and are there interaction effects between what Craig's monitoring in the wastewater to the kinds of things you're talking about? What would be the synergies of having our focus, at least in one place, that where we brought all these perspectives together? And then if that worked, to think about taking it in other places in the West, in either Utah, New Mexico, et cetera, just to see, and maybe it's better, maybe it's fine just to do these things separately, but maybe if we stop and think about it, there are ways that doing them in the same place would give us a more holistic view of what the health situation is in that state. So I want you to sort of riff on what possibilities, when you heard each other's presentations, what possibilities of interaction were there.
When I heard Mary's presentation, I actually, that's when I made a change to my presentation and added in air monitoring. Because I think that could accompany one of these mobile units pretty easily. I think that would be nice. And I got excited also hearing about the thinking about fires and being able to deploy something in real time at locations, strategic locations. The Fresno idea, that could be after Stanford, right? I mean, that could be where we go next. That would be, yeah. I think that'd be exciting.
Yeah, because when I invested in Craig, he outed me. I wasn't telling the political science community because the opportunity costs for political scientists were pretty high. But I saw in this that it seems to me that understanding the social consequences and the policy consequences of being able to do this censoring is going to be huge. And what you're doing is only one part of a larger question about privacy and the rest that the law school's got to get involved in, and thinking about exactly how do you protect privacy with these kinds of powerful sensors and monitoring. But let's forget that for a minute, because you're staying at an aggregated level. But it seems to me that I think social scientists could help with some of the things that Chris was talking about, which is, okay, well, or that you were talking about, Mary, which is how does the information get out there? How do you, to what extent is it up to the community versus if the air and the pollution is coming from fire practices elsewhere? If there are private lands that are not doing control burns, or if there are state lands because of fiscal reasons didn't do control burns, then that's a policy question that has to be brought up, because there's nothing Fresno can do if people aren't doing their control burns and you're getting uncontrolled burns, right? So a lot of this is figuring out what, just educating Fresno doesn't help them if the pollution is going to continue to stream over from other places, right? So I think having social science component to this, again, I just think the whole might be greater than the sum of the parts.
More comments? Mary?
I was just going to say that when I heard your presentation, I wanted to get on the bus. And I was thinking about what populations you could sample blood from and see. Is it the older population? Is it the young teens? Is it the pregnant women? How does that associate with the wastewater? And like within Fresno, there's several zip codes. Most of the population is very poor, but there's one particular zip code where all the really wealthy people live. So it'd also be interesting to see how those types of factors associate with the wastewater and the health effects.
Yeah, and Chris, we had this talk yesterday, which I didn't find terribly useful, but that did give the thought of the air conditioning component. And this notion that 90% of the people have air conditioning, I don't believe that's true in California, because I can assure you, I've never lived anywhere that had air conditioning, so I didn't want to argue with the guy, but never mind that. But I do think that there probably are, different systems of air filtering in different buildings, and also communities that are more exposed to the air because some people may have air conditioning in the wealthier areas. So it seems to me that even what you're interested in could be done in the same way that Mary was talking about, looking at how different segments of the population are affected by these environmental factors.
I was born and lived my early years in Dinuba, which is just down the road from Fresno. So as a Central Valley native, and my mother always said that my problems were associated with the fact that the crop dusters didn't really pull up above our house. They just left the spray on. So, I do think they're a compelling set of problems, and in many cases, ground zero for the intersection between the climate issues, the environmental justice issues, and the public health issues really do come into focus in places like the Central Valley. In the context of our discussion, I think it's important to note that Fresno is a giant urban area. It's not the rural West, but it's what it's where the people in the West are, and I think that makes it a compelling choice.
Well, would it make more sense, would it be easier to study if we went to a smaller community that was near there, like a Dinuba? I mean, does that affect?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Fresno is really interesting and important because we live in an urban world, and a lot of the issues with, for example, relocation, the intersection between education and public health are ones that will play out in important ways more in the urban areas than rural. And I think that if we're designing a project for the Central Valley, it should incorporate the real rural areas as well. But it's important to note that most of California is heavily urbanized.
So, Chris, I wanted to do a follow-up on a couple of points you made. One I thought was really interesting, that ozone precursors under high temperatures may exacerbate essentially the potential health effects. And I don't think that, I personally think there's not enough attention on the real life human health effects associated with climate change. That would be I'm curious what the science is there, and I would think that Fresno, as a surrogate place for the entire Central Valley in terms of temperature, would be a terrific place to potentially develop more science around that. So one question is, what is the state of the science to that question? Is there a way to potentially bring more attention to this issue? Because again, climate change does feel to many, from a political perspective, like it is not that relevant today, and certainly not on a human health side of the equation. So that's one question.
Yeah, well, the scholarship on high temperatures and ozone is, it's relatively mature. It's really complicated. It depends on the mix of chemicals in the atmosphere. A good example is that methane is not a directly health active gas, but methane is an important controller on the level of hydroxyl radicals in the atmosphere, and the hydroxyl radicals are the sort of driving force for the chemistry that can make ozone. And so in some ways, what methane's doing is it's scrubbing away the atmosphere's cleaning agents. And so there are many, many complicated interactions, but I think that one of the things that needs to be considered is how different kinds of steps to address air quality issues, like switching from wildfires to controlled burns, influences the mix of chemicals that do control the agents that are dangerous for public health.
Great. So my second question, I knew you'd get optimistic toward the end of your presentation, and you talked about the potential sweet spot here with mitigation and adaptation working together, and getting the economics right, and presented this potential opportunity on the forestry side, and more generally on soil carbon and sequestration. there's been a lot of talk about economic transfers, generally in connection with tropical forests and that sort of thing in the international space. Is there a way for California potentially, I know you're deeply involved in this in Sacramento, to see some investments in carbon sequestration and healthy forests and to do some piloting of economic transfers that would help the rural West take advantage of its resource base and view this as a plus and not a minus? And
Yeah, California has a cap and trade environment and a whole bunch of complementary policies. Some of the most interesting things that California does are almost in the nature of experiments, and it has two offset protocols that individuals and corporations can use to generate permits that you can essentially use as alternatives to the cap and trade mechanism. One is in farmland methane production and from rice paddies, and the other is in forests. And so currently, California has, for the last 5 years now, an official protocol where forest owners can apply to have permission to generate official credits that can be put into the cap and trade system. And it has the potential to really produce significant economic income for forest managers, not only in California, but around the country. California has rules that prevent the forest offset program from being used internationally, and there's an active discussion about that. But I think that this offset protocol provides a really interesting crucible for experimentation. And if we can demonstrate that it really works, that it addresses the environmental justice issues, that there's not unacceptable levels of leakage, that we can really begin to explore more and more of these offset protocols in soil health, in coastal ecosystems, and in ways around the state and around the country where we're both building better ecosystems, achieving conservation values, at the same time achieving climate values by storing carbon.
Great. Other questions? We got a couple more minutes. Thought Bruce's question to the whole panel was great. Any others looking for commentary, or among the three of you, reactions to the presentations you heard? Any final thoughts?
Well, I just say that for me, this intersection between public health and climate responses is really interesting and really important. And we emphasize a lot of the problems, but I think that being able to take steps where we're improving air quality, where we're investing in people, and where we're addressing climate at the same time really is a path forward that, in response to the question about how do you get stakeholders to agree that this is worth doing, you get short-term benefits as well as long-term benefits. And I think it is in many ways the most compelling sweet spot in the environmental landscape at this point.
Phil?
One last question. How do you bring the millennials more into the discussion on the action side of this equation? So I hate to use the Yiddish word for me, the altekakas, and the younger people come a little closer in the communication path, is because it is a matter of collaboration and integration of the thought process. And there's a big challenge. I mean, whether it's local, regional, and last year, one last comment, it wasn't all that pleasant, even in the state legislature on climate change policy. There was those who were for regionalization of it. That's the governor, and those who said, let's deal with the state. And then there was a dynamic between the moderate Democrats who had money coming from certain sources that were still into fossil, and the ones who were more progressive. So I want to remain optimistic.
I didn't want to say it was a group hug or anything.
Okay,
but,
so you gave a true hope, because I lived through that through my significant other, my wife, who was really pushing to get policy done, and it was put on a delay structure. So not to take the momentum of your thoughts, but the reality wasn't quite as upbeat. I know Jerry's ending with his conference in September, which hopefully is very upbeat.
Is that a question, Phil?
Well, I mean, in terms of of how to appeal to millennials, I see some millennials in the audience. I'm probably not the best person to address that.
Well, actually, I mean, what you were referring to was largely over the transportation piece of the mitigation. And that has a definite rural-urban distinction. That is to say, it's easier to think about mass transit for urban communities, but when we've got people increasingly in exurbs and rural areas that are commuting in to work at places like Stanford and have to be in the car for 2.5 or 3 hours, it's not easy to think about that solution. And electric cars are A, expensive, and B, you know, you're still going to have people clogging the roads and coming a long distance, which will mean other people that are not in electric vehicles will be slowed down and emitting more. So the whole question of transportation with respect to rural areas and respect to disadvantaged communities is much more complex than whether the oil companies were giving money to the representatives. It's a really deep problem.
Okay, shall we wrap? Let's thank our terrific panel. Thank you.